Welcome to the Project Management PrepCast, the key to PMP exam success. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome back to the Project Management PrepCast, where we tell you what's in and out of scope for your PMP exam. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner. The define scope process is the process of describing a detailed description of the project and the product. The key benefit of this process is that we will take the requirements that we gathered earlier, we decide which ones are going to be in scope or out of scope, and then we describe them. This lesson will focus on defining and discussing the defined scope process. Discuss creating a detailed project scope. Detail how the process inputs influence changes to the scope, and distinguish between the project charter and the project scope statement. The official definition for the project scope management knowledge area is that it includes the processes required to ensure that the project includes all the work required and only the work required to complete our project successfully. And to help us with that, we have 6 processes, beginning with plan scope management, the process of creating a scope management plan that documents how the project scope will be defined, validated, and controlled. Once we know that, we're going to be collecting requirements from our stakeholders. This is the process of determining, documenting, and managing stakeholder needs and requirements to meet project objectives. And now that we have the requirements, we will convert those into our actual scope. Or to be precise, we will define our scope. This is the process of developing a detailed description of the project and product. Once we have that, we want to create our WBS in the process of subdividing project deliverables and project work into smaller, more manageable components. Then at some point we're going to have to show everything to the customer, and the customer has to accept our deliverables. This is done in validate scope, the process of formally accepting the completed project deliverables. And last but not least, let's not forget about scope creep here. We have to control our scope. This is the process of monitoring the status of the project and product scope and managing changes to the scope baseline. And when it comes to the question of into which process groups do our processes in this knowledge area fall, well, the answer is quite simple. They're either in the planning process group or in the monitoring and controlling process group. The process of defined scope, our focus right now, it is a planning process. The main concept behind this process is that it provides a detailed understanding of the requirements to be executed and delivered to meet the needs and expectations of the stakeholders, and we do that by describing the product, service, or result based on defining the requirements that will be included in or excluded from the project scope, and then we can go ahead and we can develop a detailed project scope statement. Developing and documenting a detailed project scope is critical to the success of the project and beneficial to your project going forward, since it builds upon the major deliverables, assumptions, and constraints that are developed and documented during project initiation. During the planning of the project, you define and describe the scope, and you're getting more and more detailed and specific as more and more information about the project is getting known and is being established. Developing and documenting your detailed project scope statement also exposes additional risks, assumptions, and constraints which are analyzed for completeness, validity, and added or updated as needed. By the end of the defined scope process, you will have a much more detailed scope statement available, and this will help to improve the accuracy of your cost, time, and resource estimates. It will define a detailed scope baseline, and last but not least, it will also support having clear assignments on a detailed scope level. These assignments, they won't be done in this process here, but without having your scope defined in detail, well, you can't assign any tasks to your team members to actually develop that scope. The defined scope process is highly iterative. At the beginning, we develop a high-level vision early on for our overall project because at that time not enough information may be known, so we stay very high level. Then, as we go through this process again and again and again, we will determine the detail of the scope that needs to be done, one iteration at a time. The high-level requirements that we had at the very beginning are then broken down into more specific, smaller and manageable components, features and functionalities, and more detailed is added over time. This technique of breaking things down is called decomposition. We also discussed this in the process of Create WBS, the next one in our series of lessons. So what is your role, the project manager's role, during the define scope process? Well, as a project manager, understanding and being able to define project scope will give you focus and sense of purpose when executing the project. Understanding the scope provides you and the team with the foundations for managing project change and risk management. It establishes goal setting and a timeline to work towards, as well as key points for reporting on the progress of the project to senior management and other stakeholders. Ultimately, having a detailed scope will help you as the project manager improve the accuracy of the cost, time and resource estimates. Here is the ITTO overview from the PMBOK guide, and as you can see, all of these inputs, tools, techniques and outputs are obviously helping us to define our scope. As inputs, we have everything that is scope requirements related, like the project charter that contains a high-level scope, like the requirements documentation that tells us what our stakeholders want to achieve with this project. We then apply our tools and techniques to these inputs that help us define our scope, like expert judgment or product analysis, and we then create our two outputs. Obviously, the project scope statement has to be there because that's our main focus. After all, the process is called defined scope, and because we do this iteratively over time, we will add more and more detail to our information, which means we have to update project documents as well. Let's jump into the details. We have 4 inputs to this process, and they are the scope management plan, the project charter, requirements documentation, and a few organizational process assets. So we only have 4 inputs here. That is because, remember, this is one of the early processes that we execute on our project. So little is usually known at the beginning. So other processes cannot feed all too much into our process here. So 4 is quite sufficient. Our first input is the scope management plan. It is a component of our overall project management plan, and as such, the scope management plan provides us with a description of how our scope will be defined, developed, monitored, and controlled. It will therefore help us to create the required boundaries and framework to guide us in developing our project scope. Allow me to do a quick detour here and talk about the iterative nature of this process a little bit, because we said define scope is not a process that you do once and then you are done, because I can promise you that your customers will always want to add requirements after you have already started working on your project. So you will receive change requests for implementation. And of course, consequently, you must therefore revisit this process here. But only after these change requests have been properly approved via the Perform Integrated Change Control process. So you return to this process, you take the approved change requests, and you describe the additional scope in detail. The project charter is our next input. It is the documentation, the formal documentation by our organization that provides the high-level description and product characteristics and formally authorizes our project. It also contains project approval requirements. Since this process will be creating a detailed view of our scope, the project charter is needed as an input here. Some companies don't actually use a project charter. They instead may be using some kind of a formal analysis to capture the overall goals of the project, constraints and assumptions, and identify any other content necessary to develop the scope. But for the PMP exam, the project charter is our input because it contains high-level information about our project scope. Our next input is the requirements documentation, which comes to us straight from the Collect Requirements process. The requirements documentation provides a description of how individual requirements meet the business need for our project. Requirements tend to start out again at a high level, and as more information is known, they become more detailed. Stakeholder requirements and how they relate to the project and the overall business needs are also included. It's important to note that you as a project manager, you will not be able to define the project scope that answers the need of your stakeholders and meets the business goals without these clearly defined requirements. So in order for you to define the scope, you need to know the stakeholder requirements. Organizational process assets will influence how you execute your project and also how you define your scope. I have 3 examples for you. First of all, we can use templates and project files from previous projects. Most companies have a central document repository from previous projects that we can now access. These documents can be used as historical information and can be crucial when it comes to decision points throughout the project lifecycle. The policies and procedures that are predefined for our company and the project and the client company as a whole can be used as well. They can be technical, functional, managerial in nature in order to align our project goals with the high-level business strategies. And of course, lessons learned files from previous projects. This is the knowledge gained during a project that shows how project events were addressed in the past or should be addressed in the future with the purpose of improving future performance. As we are moving on to the tools and techniques of this process, let us just remind ourselves that our 4 inputs, the scope management plan, the project charter, the requirements documentation, and the few organizational process assets we just discussed, all center around our scope and help us to define it. But they just give us the basic information. We now need to do something with these inputs. We now will apply our tools and techniques to them. We have expert judgment, we have product analysis, we have alternatives generation, and we will apply facilitated workshops. Our first tool, expert judgment, involves having experts work with the project team to develop portions of the detailed project scope statement. These experts provide judgment and expertise that can be provided on any technical detail. Some experts that we may bring onto our project are the SMEs, also known as the subject matter experts. We can bring on consultants, contractors, stakeholders, including customers or sponsors, professional and technical associations, industry groups, or other units within our organization. These different expert groups need to come together and work as a team during the defined scope process of our project. Most of the time, subject matter experts are brought on board on a project for very specialized or technical areas. Therefore, the functional expert, sometimes called the technical communicators, technical writers, business analysts, etc., they extract technical information and convert it into a form that is suitable for our many project stakeholders. These functional experts, like a business analyst, they understand how to bridge the gap between the technical lingo and managerial aspects of the project, and they are able to translate these technical requirements into strategic business needs of a project. For those projects that have a product as a deliverable and not just a service or a result, product analysis can be quite effective as a tool for improving the project team's understanding of the product and help to capture that understanding in the form of requirements and translate the description into deliverables. Product analysis includes techniques such as product breakdown, systems analysis, requirements analysis, systems engineering, value engineering, and value analysis. Brainstorming, lateral thinking, and analysis of alternatives. These are all techniques to generate creative thought and are all examples of the alternatives generation techniques. The goal of alternatives generation techniques is to make sure that the project team is properly considering all options as they relate to our project scope. For this, the team develops as many potential options as possible for our scope as a means to identify distinct approaches to executing and performing the work on our project. Of course, the main goal behind alternatives generation is there's usually more than one way of doing things, and it's better to know which 3 ways are open to us, and then we can choose the best one. And one way of generating these alternatives, or also doing a product analysis or bringing in our expert judgment, the other tools and techniques, is via facilitated workshops. These are focus sessions that assemble our stakeholders together and help us to define our project scope. These sessions are considered a vital technique for quickly defining cross-functional requirements and resolving differences that may exist between the stakeholders. These workshops are interactive, so they serve to build trust and foster communication between all the participants on our project, and this can lead to a common understanding of our project objectives and its limits, all things that help us define the project scope. We have now arrived at the outputs for the defined scope process. There are only 2 of them, but these outputs are essential. They define the scope for our project in detail, and they also document changes and updates that were made during this process. And of course, they are the project scope statement and updates to our project documents. The project scope statement is a document that describes many details pertaining to the project and product scope. When we say it documents the project scope, we mean the entire scope, which includes both the project and product scope. The project scope statement may actually assist in managing the expectations of stakeholders, since scope exclusions are also contained. Let's take a look at some of the elements that you will find in your project scope statement. First of all, obviously the product scope description. Through progressive elaboration, the characteristics of your product, service, or result are described. It also contains acceptance criteria. These are those conditions that must be met in order for our deliverables to be acceptable. Then, of course, because we have acceptance criteria for deliverables, guess what? The deliverables are described as well in here. A deliverable is a unique and quantifiable product, result, or ability to perform a service that is produced upon the completion of a process, phase, or project, which may be described at a summary level or at detail. When you think of a deliverable, it could be an object or a functional aspect of your overall project. But what we will also need to include are project exclusions. Yes, we include exclusions. These identify and explicitly state what is out of scope for our project and therefore excluded from the project. It helps to manage the expectations of our stakeholders if we clearly state what's in our project and what's out of our project. Well, and then we're getting to the constraints. Those are limiting factors or restrictions that affect project or process execution. And since we have the constraints, we also have assumptions as an element of our project scope statement. Assumptions are planning process factors that are simply assumed to be real or true without proof. The content that you will find in your project charter and in your project scope statement are somewhat overlapping. However, they are different in the level of detail that is contained in each. The project charter contains more high-level and summary type content, since it is created during project initiation and requirements are still being developed. Some of the key elements of the project charter are the project purpose, measurable project objectives, high-level risks, high-level requirements, and project description, a summary budget, a stakeholder list, and most importantly, you as the project manager are assigned and named in the project charter. The project scope statement, on the other hand, contains a more detailed description of the scope and the scope elements that are progressively elaborated throughout the project. Again, some of the key elements are a progressively elaborated project scope description, acceptance criteria, and then project deliverables, exclusions, constraints, and assumptions, as we just learned from the elements review on the previous two slides. Again, remember, this list does not show all of the contents of the charter or of the scope statement, but it provides you with a good representation of what elements are most likely contained. Our second and final output from the defined scope process are the updates to our project documents. And the documents that we may be updating here are the stakeholder register, requirements documentation, and the requirements traceability matrix. The iterative nature of this process here, defined scope, will result in a project scope description that continues to be revisited and refined as the project continues. The progressive emergence of the project scope means that project documents will require updates. Let's look at these a little bit more in detail. So the stakeholder register, it captures major requirements and expectations for the project and is used to identify stakeholders who can provide information on the requirements. As you define project scope, requirements and expectations may change, therefore updates are required, or you may simply identify additional stakeholders. Then we have the requirements documentation. This describes how individual requirements meet the needs for the project. Requirements typically start out at a high level but progressively become more and more detailed as more is discovered about them. And finally, the requirements traceability matrix. This links our product requirements from their origin to the deliverables that satisfy them, and it provides a way of tracking those requirements throughout the project lifecycle. As requirements change, as we find more about them, learn more about them, more details, this matrix will require updating. Let's review. Defined scope is the process of developing a detailed project and product description. The importance of this process is directly related to how important the requirements are. The scope of the project is what ultimately drives the execution of the project. The iterative nature of the defined scope process means that this process will be revisited many times throughout the project lifecycle to continue to develop a detailed scope. The project scope statement documents the entire scope, both the project and the product scope, and it is essential in managing stakeholder expectations because it includes items that are excluded from the scope. The project charter and the project scope statement contain similar information, but not the same. The project charter contains high-level information regarding the scope elements, while the project scope statement contains a more detailed scope description of our scope elements. And to apply your newly gained knowledge about this process, let's apply it to a PMP exam sample question that you may find online or in a book. Here it is. Not all requirements identified in collect requirements may be included in the project. The defined scope process selects the final requirements from, is it A, the scope management plan, B, the requirements documentation which was delivered during the collect requirements process, C, the project scope statement, or is it D, acceptance criteria? Again, I'll give you a few seconds here for this. The answer is, of course, that it is B, the requirements documentation that was delivered during the collect requirements process. From here, defined scope then develops a detailed description of the project and product, service or result. And this concludes our look at the defined scope process. So it's time for Justine to say,
have a nice evening.
And of course I say, until next time.